Hey guys, what's up? So I wanted to look back at a pretty underrated animated show, which is Wolverine and the X-Men. The show itself was released in 2009 on the Nicktoons channel, and if you're a person that grew up in the 90s like me, then you'll remember watching the classic X-Men cartoon. Or if you grew up in the early 2000s, then you'd also remember watching X-Men Evolution, both of which are great in their own right, and I've already reviewed both the shows. Wolverine and the X-Men, I feel, is very forgotten compared to those two shows. And I don't know why, because to me, this show had a lot of potential to be the best X-Men cartoon to date. Yes, even better than the 90s X-Men cartoon, which I thought was great in its own right. But the show to me doesn't really hold up too well, but that's just me. I'm not sure if people didn't like it as much because they're so sick and tired of Wolverine always being the main character, which, yeah, judging by the title, Wolverine pretty much is the main character of this whole show. But on the other hand, I don't really mind it too much. I just want a good show, and it really was. Sadly, it was short-lived, and I'll get to that later on in the video. So what happens when you take some of the best X-Men storylines and characters from the last 40 plus years and put them all together in this new animated series? You get Wolverine and the X-Men. Professor Xavier created the Xavier Institute for the Gifted Youngsters to help train the young mutants to use their powers and teach them how to live in peace with the rest of humanity. The story begins with the Institute coming under the attack from under the Source, and Professor Xavier and Jean Grey are supposedly killed in the attack. With the leadership of the X-Men crippled and the school in the ruins, the school and team are disbanded. Skip ahead 1 year and all of the X-Men have gone their own ways. Wolverine is out in his own way trying to avoid being captured by the Mutant Response Division. Cyclops has been reinverted to the emo version of the character. Angel is trying to stop his father from creating mutant hunting robots. Wolverine tracks down Beast, who is living in the ruins of the mansion, and together they go off to find the remaining X-Men and enlist their aid in rescuing their teammates who have been captured by the Mutant Response Division. The X-Men save their teammates, but this new action causes Senator Kelly to push the new Mutant Registration Act, requiring the documentation of anyone with powers. He is also pushing the new Sentinel program forward. These robots would be used to hunt down rogue mutants and protect humanity. With the help from Angel, the mansion is rebuilt, and the X-Men have to place their call once again, only to have a new house guest, the White Queen. Emma Frost arrives on site and offers her services to locate the missing Professor Xavier. Using her Cerebro, she is able to pinpoint the location and learns that he is in Genosha. And who is the ruler of Genosha? Why, Magneto, of course. A rescue is launched, and we learn from Magneto himself that Xavier only recently appeared on the shores of Genosha, and he has been taking care of his old friend. Xavier, in a catatonic state, hasn't said a word. He is taken back to the mansion, and we learn that he will not come out of his coma for 20 years. He has made contact from the future with a warning of things to come. If the X-Men can't change the key events, then the mutants and humanity are doomed. Now the X-Men must work together to prevent the dark future, aka the Days of a Future Past storyline, from happening. Most animated TV series about a superhero team begins with an origin. Wolverine and the X-Men instead open with their destruction. Without warning, some sort of explosion blast lays waste to Xavier's school for the gifted youngsters. A smoldering wheelchair is the only trace that remains of Professor Xavier. Jean Grey is nowhere to be found, and the mansion itself is a smoldering crater, and the X-Men are no more. Now, I grew up reading the Claremont Byrne run in the comics, and to try to be as friendly with the readers as possible, those books are bogged down to the reams of the clunky exposition. The X-Men would have to awkwardly explain how their powers work, what their tangled web of relationship looks like, and what their backstories are. As much as I love those books, that always seems to stomp all over the flow of the story whenever I revisit them. However, Wolverine and the X-Men isn't like that at all. If you missed the previously on, you're not going to get any dialogue recapping what you might have missed. No one ever really stands around and talks, and now no one yanking around their powers functioning in the middle of the fight. No, Wolverine and the X-Men hits the grounds running and never eases to throttle. Sure, there's enough context that someone who's uninitiated can still follow what's going on, but the whole thing is very much in the media res. The rogues gallery throughout Wolverine and the X-Men is massive, but the X-Men are all too familiar with most of them at the outset. The characters in the series generally know who each other are and how their powers function. Since it doesn't have to keep explaining everything in sight, this approach just frees up that much time for the action. Wolverine and the X-Men also have to juggle the two district timelines, one a group of X-Men in the present and another fighting for survival in the future. And that's balanced flawlessly as well. Both eras are equally compelling, and being able to leap back and forth between them infuses this series with quite a bit of vitality. Nothing is even given a chance to get stale. I'm really impressed of just by how swiftly Wolverine and the X-Men moves, and it covers a colossal amount of ground in space of a single season. Rather than picking up where X-Men Evolution left off, the series has its own district of continuity, piecemealing together the elements from Chris Claremont's epic run of the Uncanny X-Men, the New X-Men, the Ultimate books, the movies, and even a little previous animated takes on these characters. There aren't all many adaptations, but you don't get to update the first version of Wolverine and the Hulk battle as well as the elements drawn from the Fall of the Mutants. The various Weapon X stories, Days of Future Past, the Dark Phoenix saga, and pretty much everything Grant Morrison hammered into the New X-Men. The list of bad nicks, the cameos, and the guest stars is endless. The number thrown out is 70 different mutants even. To rattle off a few, Bishop, Marrow, the Shadow King, Psylocke, Rockslide, Dazzler, Mystique, Harpoon, Sabretooth, Mojo, Spiral, the Reavers, Nick Fury, Blink, Hellion, Multiple Man, Nitro, Ratchet Rita, Dust, Boom Boom, Domino, Magma, Pixie, Wolfsbane, Polaris, X-23, Scarlet Witch, the Juggernaut, Rover, Squirrel Boy, and Mr. Sinister. Heck, you even get a look at Wolverine in his original striped costume, as well as the original 5 Xavier's First Class. Wolverine and the X-Men does a terrific job juggling such a sprawling cast too. Some of those names I just mentioned only appear in the background. Even glossing over sorts of cameos, the series doesn't insist on shoehorning every character in each episode, so there's not a constant competition for screen time, allowing them to be better fleshed out individually. A select few are larvished with their own showcase episodes as well, giving that much more of an opportunity to shine. The character designs are pretty great too. They're really exaggerated, of course. The women, awfully top-heavy, while the men's hyper-muscular arms are generally 3 or 4 times as thick as their arms. That's to be expected from any animated series, and they generally look very much like the characters I know and love. The designs too draw from the different continuities. Toad is straight out of the pages of Ultimate X-Men. For instance, while Nick Fury that guest stars here is a hybrid of characters from the 616 and the Ultimate books, no one looks embarrassing or ridiculous. Not any more than they do in the comics, at least. With the possible exception of Domino, whose breast is so overly inflated that she's about to spill out her top. I'm kind of surprised the show could get away with that, and the surprisingly faithful recreation of Emma Frost's skimpy X-lingerie costume, considering this aired on Nickelodeon's Run channel at all. One of the great things about Wolverine and the X-Men is not the amount of cleavage, but that the show isn't watered down. Again, it's not bogged down by the reams of the explanatory dialogue, instead assuming that the viewer knows who these characters are. And it offers enough context to be kinda sorta coherent to the uninitiated. Rather than bother with one and dones on small self-contained arcs, Wolverine and the X-Men weaves together on one massive story. The episodes are still individually satisfying, but it's almost always advancing the central plot at the same time, and it's kind of a thrill to see its many individual threads start to intertwine. Jiggling Mound the Fresh aside, the imagery is entirely appropriate for younger viewers. No blood, and nearly no existent body count, and yet it still manages to be impressively dark and intense, Sure, if a helicopter gets shot down, you'll see the pilots leap to safety to the near building, the same as the G.I. Joe episodes a lot of us grew up with. Weapons rather disemboweling or dismembering anyone. It still feels as if there are stakes though. The X-Men aren't a bunch of pals who live in a mansion that serves as an oversized clubhouse. They're teammates banding together to fight a war. It's really not a sunny cherry series. There aren't really that many mustache-twirling villains either. Very few are motivated by the money or greed. No matter what the terrible acts they may commit, they're doing it because they believe in their own right. And that's so much more compelling. The choreography for the action is really incredible too. From Domino the gymnastic gunplay to a sentinel slamming down a nearby severe robot arm. These sequences are swift, acrobatic, and devastating. Wolverine and the X-Men does its job at getting me to invest in the story. The action on this scale just makes it so much fun to watch. Some of the characterizations may rub fans the wrong way. Like Quicksilver here is a sycophant desperate to please his father. Emma Frost's biting whip briefly rears on its head early on, but it makes its way for the doe-eyed, unquitted love. I miss the edge her character has in the comics. Forge is a gangly teenager played for comic relief, and Cyclops spends a big chunk of the seasons moping around about missing his girlfriend. Some of these changes work well. The knee-jerk reaction a lot of people may have is the whole Wolverine plays in this series, with fans barking that he's never been a leader. Wolverine realizes from word on that he's a bruiser, a weapon, not a leader. He struggles with that, and so does the rest of the team. Wolverine eventually settles into the role without feeling as if his character has been shoehorned in it to fit. It's earned and it's deserved. By the same token, I enjoy seeing Cyclops as someone who prefers to stay isolated and very gradually becomes part of the team once again. I'd shudder to guess how many hundreds of X-Men comics I devoured over the years. I've seen Cyclops, Storm, and Professor Xavier lead the team time and time again, and kinda like the idea of seeing a different dynamic as long as it makes as much sense as it does here. The voice acting throughout Wolverine and the X-Men is generally strong as well. There's a noticeable attempt to have some of these characters sound like they do in the movies, Beast, Magneto, and Professor Xavier in particular, and Steve Bloom's take on Wolverine's dead-on version of what I hear in my head whenever I pick up an X-book. Characters with a thick accent suffering pretty badly. Sometimes they work, such as Nightcrawler, but others like Rogue, Gambit, and Colossus exaggerated those accents to the point to where they're pretty hard to stomach. Thankfully, the worst are a bunch of fairly minor characters in the overall scheme of things. I'm really impressed by how consistently great Wolverine and the X-Men is. But Wolverine and the X-Men does so much right than it does wrong. It's just an endless adrenaline rush. I'm surprised how invested I found myself in its bleak, apocalyptic storyline, and its sporadic, playful sense of humor is a lot of fun too. Heck, Wolverine and the X-Men really made me like Rogue for the first time in ages. And Bishop for the first time in, well, ever. So it's gotta be doing something right. This is one of my favorite animated series of all time, but it's a damn shame the show was cancelled. I don't know the exact reason for why the show was cancelled, but I'm pretty sure it had something to do with Disney buying the Marvel rights. Similar to Spectacular Spider-Man getting the cancellation. But I've also heard the animation for the show was getting too expensive. But who knows? Disney already bought all the Fox X-Men rights, and there has been talk of Disney rebranding Marvel Animations, so I can only hope the show is revived, but I doubt it. Still, its first season tells the satisfying complete story, and one that's rather sprawling and epic at that. This series is a dream come true for fans, and it is great for newcomers as well, and I highly recommend you watch the first season. Wolverine and the X-Men gets a 9.9 out of 10. This is Red Wolf signing out, and I'll see you next time. Peace.